I'm using simple tools and materials to make furniture and decor for this miniature dollhouse cabinet. Each of these tiny rooms is barely bigger than a Lego, so instead of working in such tiny spaces, I'm making some cardstock walls. To remove the bulk from each corner, I'm using my craft knife at a slight angle to remove a V-shaped wedge. This is a handmade piece, so each of these rooms might be a slightly different size, so I'm numbering each of my room boxes. I'm using a bit of the cabinet paint to hide the cardstock edges. I've come up with a plan for each room, so now I'm moving the stairs to a safe place. Now that I have an idea of what each room will be, it'll be easier to choose the wallpaper. I'm using a combo of miniature wallpaper, scrap paper, and cutouts from magazines and a pamphlet. I'm using a bit of this art to look like a mural. I'm attaching it with double-sided tape and cutting away the excess. It's a lot easier to wallpaper this cardstock versus these teeny walls. For the rest of the gluing, I decided to use a glue stick. It's a low moisture option that won't ripple my wallpaper. I'm using the scrap of 1/12 scale miniature tile I got from a miniature grab bag for the bathroom walls and the floor. And this is why miniaturists have a hard time throwing anything away. These stripes will be some carpeting in a bedroom, and I drew some lines on this piece from a magazine to simulate tile. I love the aesthetic of a black and white tile floor, so I cut some pieces out from the pamphlet to piece together my own floor. This will be in the dining room, so I'm hoping the center rectangle looks like a rug. I made a cardstock room to show off each of the floor and wallpaper combos since it's a little tricky to film in such a tiny space. This part of the project took me about 8 hours because I was thinking about it so intensely you would have thought someone's life was on the line. I'm adding so much furniture and decor, we'll see how much of this we can even see in the end. Each of the hallways is getting the same miniature wallpaper glued directly to the walls with glue stick. I'm quickly finishing each of the floors by adding a coat of dark wax and painting the ceilings gold. Now we can move on to furniture and accessories. I'm starting in the bathroom with this marker cap. I sliced the tip off with my craft knife and cut it in half to make a tiny sink for the wall. At this scale, the lines of the marker cap look like the ridges of a fancy porcelain sink. I'm using gold no-hole nail beads as the taps and faucet on the wall. Every bathroom needs a mirror, so I'm gluing a small jump ring to some metallic paper I got with makeup brushes. You could also use aluminum foil. Let me know what you think, but I think the first mirror is a bit too big, so I made another smaller mirror so it's a better scale for the sink. To make a Victorian style toilet, I glued one of these plastic confetti pieces to a painted bit of Q-tip. I combined a small chunk of wood and a plastic rod painted gold to make this high tank toilet. I'm using this plastic piece I got from a Ziploc bag as the bathtub by trimming off the edges and capping the holes with some paper. After trimming the paper, I painted the tub gold and filled it with diamond glaze and beads to look like water and bubbles. I bent a thin piece of wire to look like a tub spout and inserted it in the diamond glaze before it was dry. Now I'm moving on to another room, starting by making some accordion folds in a piece of cardstock paper. I'm slightly flattening my folded cardstock so I can cut a strip off the bottom. I'll leave the rest of it intact. I'm using acrylic paint to paint some of the accordion folds. You could also just use a marker for this if you don't want to pull out your paints in a tiny brush. I'm sealing the paper using a mixture of Mod Podge and a little bit of brown paint for age and interest. These little strips of paper will become tiny books. I cut 3 strips from the larger chunk of paper. To form the books, I added a tiny dab of glue to each of the accordion folds for the front and the back. When you compress the strip, the folds look like book covers. Books often have gold detail on the spine, so I'm using a marker to add 2 dots to each of the books. The marker dots look pretty chunky, so for more realism, I used just the side of the marker along the top and bottom edge so there's a much thinner line. My rows and rows of books need a home, so I'm using some cereal box to make a bookshelf. I'm cutting a rectangle out of the middle so I can add some magazine cutout to look like a window without adding bulk or thickness. My Dollar Tree marker has a greenish gold hue, so I'm painting this matchstick and the cereal box pieces with acrylic gold paint. I used the matchstick as a window seat and across the whole bottom of the shelf. I added the books with some of them on their sides for added interest, as well as some beads and even this tiny potted plant. There are even pillows on the window seat. I still have lots of leftover books I may be able to use in the rest of the dollhouse. I realized the window looked really flat, so I removed the pillows and added some diamond glaze for shine. There's still lots of floor space in the library, so I'm using a bit of scrap from 1/12 scale dollhouse trim to make a statue for the floor. I'm cutting away one of the tabs so it can sit flat on the floor, but I'm leaving the other so I can glue a bit of this horse charm to the top. For some added depth and age, I'm using dark wax on the bottom. If I had a tiny man's head, this would be a bust instead, but I really like it. I used the same type of scrap and some flocking as a floor plant. It looks a bit like broccoli, but it isn't. Moving into the parlor, I cut out a cello from some cereal box. This is obviously really flat and boring, so to add dimension and realism, I'm adding some wood glue. This also creates a smooth surface. While the glue was still wet, I created a hole in the wood glue and added bits of paper for more detail. I trimmed the paper after the glue dried and added acrylic paint and a sealer for shine. We simply must have a place to sit in the parlor, so I glued paper to a Q-tip and added a bit of wood. I want this paint to look more like velvet fabric, so I added baking soda for some texture. I tied 2 knots in a piece of thread and painted them gold to make miniature tassels. A gold pillow and cushion finishes the look. One of my favorite materials for dollhouse miniature making is foam core, and here I'm using it to make a bed. I've been using this floor template and my cardstock walls this entire time to keep my minis in scale. This foam core bed is luxuriously too thick, so I'm slicing it in half. This pink toile fabric coordinates nicely with the wallpaper while still providing contrast. Now the bed isn't quite tall enough, so I glued another layer to the bottom using just cardstock. To make the littlest bolster pillow, I sliced away some of this Q-tip and unpeeled some of the paper so it's not as big. I want this bed to be ultra fancy, so I glued some tissue paper to the end of a Q-tip and secured it using some string. I'm simulating fabric here, so I'm painting it gold so it's not just tissue paper white. Some of the tissue tore during painting, so now I have a shorter canopy. I'm trimming away the extra Q-tip, which I was using to hold the canopy while I shaped it and painted it. I've seen fancy beds with metallic crowns, so I'm using some of this metal filigree across the top. I like how it contrasts with my faux fabric. Some painted paper doily makes a nice throw blanket at the end of the bed. I added color to a paper Q-tip using some watered down brown paint, and now I'm lightly coating it with gold. I cut it into 2 tiny pieces. It may seem like there's no point to doing this, but I painted some white paper white, and while the paint is still wet, I'm coming in with some gray paint to create some veining. Adding the gray paint while the white paint is wet helps make a more realistic marble appearance. I punched out a circle using my 1/8 inch hole punch and added a bead to the top. I'm adding green flocking to the bead to make it look like a potted plant sitting on a nightstand. I want the nightstands to look like they have drawer pulls, so I'm adding some tiny caviar beads that are meant as nail decor. I stacked more beads to look like a perfume bottle on one of the tables. For my easiest bit of decor, I cut out 2 pieces from this metal filigree and attached a pearl bead to make them look like wall sconces. These will flank my miniature bed. For my next trick, I'm cutting out this bit from a magazine to create the illusion of a door for the bedroom. To make it look like there's door trim, I traced around the rectangle of paper and I'm cutting out the extra thickness from this cardstock. I painted the door frame gold and added a tiny bead in the center of the door as a handle. I really wrestled with how to make chairs for the dining room and finally came up with an idea of using a bead. I think this is a bead cap, and I'm removing 2 of these petal-looking things to make the back of a chair. I attached a bit of Q-tip as the seat. I'm not about to attempt fabric upholstery at this scale, so I'm using my hole punch to cut out some patterned paper from the magazine pamphlet. I coated the entire chair with gloss Mod Podge, and while it was still wet, added the paper. Now I'm making a dining table, but before I cut this coffee stir stick to length, I made the wood much thinner by using my emery board. I attached 2 staples to the bottom to act as legs, and I'm making bumpers on the feet using wood glue. I painted it brown and added some miniature plates from a Fran Sussman kit. This already looks so cute and my tiny table is pretty crowded, but I just can't stop. I used my craft knife to cut out this candelabra shape from this metal filigree bowl. This is actually a touch too tall for the room, so I removed the top a bit and added some plastic rod to look like candles. I finished the table with a bead to look like a large serving bowl. I'm not too crazy about these, but I didn't feel like making more chairs, so I'm making benches for the table using matchstick and more of the paper doily. After trimming the excess paper, I added wooden arms and more of the plaid paper for the upholstery. I painted just a hint of gold around the edges. I made 2 of these, but I only end up using 1. Now I'm moving into the kitchen and making a cabinet for the back wall using some cereal box and a bamboo skewer. To fake the look of cabinet doors, I cut out smaller squares of cereal box and glued them to the front. I've stained all of the pieces so far in this dollhouse using dark wax. For this piece, I'm covering it with gloss Mod Podge to add shine and to hold tiny caviar beans that look like knobs. I attached a marble top and realized the cabinet is half the depth of the room. I replaced the bamboo skewer with a toothpick so the cabinet won't be as deep. I also trimmed down the top to make it smaller. Now that I have some extra floor space, since I made my cabinet a lot shallower, I'm making a butcher block table. I salvaged some wood from my stash of miniature wood scraps and colored it brown. Now I'm making the tiniest accessory I've ever made. I'm using the tip of my craft knife and an aluminum lid I've had for years to cut the tiniest butcher knife you've ever seen. This is so tiny I did not take a breath after I cut it out. I'm dipping the very tip of it in some black paint to make it look like a handle. I learned this technique from a Fran Sussman class. I'm using the same aluminum lid and a Dollar Tree ball stylus to make a tiny bowl for the top of my cabinet. I cut it out using my 1/8 inch hole punch. I'm coloring some caviar beads with acrylic paint to fill my bowl with potatoes or whatever you think they are. The paint didn't cover the black very well, so I didn't end up using any of those. Behind the scenes, I've been repeatedly replacing these caviar handles, so I'm leaving them off until I'm completely done touching this cabinet. To make a lighter stain for my cereal box, I first added a coat of matte Mod Podge and then some dark wax. You can see how much lighter this is than full strength. I cut out a tiny piece to use as a cutting board and added another aluminum lid knife. Working in such a tiny scale is pretty tricky, so I'm using a seed to make some miniature meat for the counter. Even trying to paint this pink at this scale is a pain in the ass, so I'm not about to sculpt some clay. I used tan and red to simulate raw meat and painted some tissue paper to look like butcher paper for the counter. This cabinet's full, so I reattached some handles. I'm making a simple shelf using some cereal box and some tiny triangles. These will look like corbels, but I can't add them yet until I add all of the shelf decor. To make it easier to fill this tiny shelf, I'm adding some clear beads to glue paper plates to. Beside the plates, I glued 2 tiny metal beads that I'm hoping look like miniature cans. These are the itty bitty beads I used. I'm cutting off the bottom of this fancy toothpick to create a canister with a lid. I struggled enormously to glue a tiny label to this canister. I filled in the space to the right of the canister with a metal bead so it looks like a big bowl. Now I'm making lots of wall art using a colored pencil. I managed to draw some incredibly detailed botanical shapes and outline them roughly with a thin black marker. For some dimension and age, I used a brown colored pencil around the edges before gluing on some metal jump rings using dimensional magic. The dimensional magic is cloudy when it's wet, but it dries nice and clear. I'm only just noticing during editing that I made 13 pieces of art, so I'll pay a bit more attention in the future. I have a gold bead I'd love to transform into a light fixture, but it's too big. To make it work, I cut the loop off that would attach it to a string and sanded it flat, as well as flattening the petals. I glued 4 small pearl beads inside to look like light bulbs. For simple ceiling lights in the stairs, I glued a clear bead to 3 metal beads. It's mostly difficult working at such a small scale, but details like this are very quick. Off camera, I did quite a bit of sanding on the stairs to make them a similar size, since one of them was quite thin and the other one was wider. I added some color with dark brown wax and added a runner using more of the paper doily painted gold. For some unknown reason, this strip of paper doily was very reluctant to take up residence on the stairs, so I had to use liberal amounts of Mod Podge to encourage it. It took 2 weeks to make all of this tiny decor, and I mostly attached it using wax so I can reposition it or reuse it in the future. I secured the walls and floors using double-sided tape so they can easily be removed. Let me know which of the rooms is your favorite and any suggestions you have, since this stuff can be moved and removed. Consider joining my Patreon either as a free member or as a paying member for $3 a month.